Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Canada's Great Unknown, where the chilling stories from people across this country continue to come in, telling us their creepiest encounters. In this latest trilogy, we head to the forests of British Columbia, where the legend of Sasquatch pays us a visit. There's something to be said about the mysteries of the BC forests, and here are 3 stories that will make you question whether or not to enter into nature. So sit back, relax, and enjoy these allegedly true stories of Sasquatch from areas you may know. If you have a story that you would like to share with us, don't hesitate. Email us at canadasgreatunknown@gmail.com. We'd also really appreciate you following us on Twitter at CGU Stories and on Instagram and TikTok at Canada's Great Unknown. Also, if you could do us the favor, hit that subscribe button and ring that bell right here on our YouTube channel, so that way you can follow along every time we post new content to Canada's Great Unknown. Don't forget to leave a comment below and let us know what you think or stories you would like to hear about. When I was a child, I used to visit my grandparents' house in the Harrison Hot Springs area. It was a fun time had all around, as my grandparents would take me out to the lake fishing. It's a lake where I learned to water ski as well. And of course, going into my teenage years, I learned how to talk and pick up girls on the beaches. I didn't have the best childhood growing up. I was raised by my mom. I had no idea who my dad was, as I've never met him. And with my mom's troubles, I'd spend nearly every weekend with my grandparents, so that way I could get some normal semblance of life. I'm forever grateful to them for that. When my grandpa would take me out for ice cream in town, I would always ask him about these carvings of what I called monkeys as a kid. He always corrected me, telling me they were Sasquatch, a big, hairy creature that roamed around the forests of this area. Grandma and Grandpa annually would attend the local tourism event, Sasquatch Days, where the entire town would be turned into one big event for Bigfoot. It was awesome when I got to go to town with them. Grandma always used to tease me that one time when she baked an apple pie, a Sasquatch actually walked up to the kitchen window and took the pie and ate it. All she saw was the back end of this creature walking away from the house, eating her pie. I never believed that one, but with my grandma and her awesome sense of humor, I never could tell whether she was being serious or not. Grandpa, on the other hand, claimed to have had a sighting back in 1963. A couple of years after he and Grandma had moved to the area. He said one day he was mowing his lawn when he saw the dog going nuts. They had a black lab back then. The dog was barking and ran as fast as it could around the side of the house. When Grandpa went to see what was up, thinking it was a big old black bear that had been seen in the area recently, he saw his trusty dog barking at something on 2 feet. Grandpa yelled at what he thought was a bear standing on its hind legs to get on out of here. But when the thing turned to look at my grandpa, he said it was no bear. This thing, a Bigfoot, snorted back at him, then walked 50 or so feet into the forest and disappeared. This now brings us to today. A few years ago, after my grandmother passed, I ended up inheriting their house in Harrison. I was the only grandchild of my grandparents, and right before my grandpa passed away in 2009, he took me into his study where he told me that he and Grandma wanted me to have the house because it was one of the only places during my childhood where I had positive and good memories. So after Grandma passed in 2013, I took over the house, using it as a weekend getaway for my wife and our daughter. The house is situated on the east side of the lake, Without giving away my location too much, it's surrounded by forest, horseshoed in with my closest neighbor being about half a kilometer away. It wasn't any surprise to wake up to wild animals in the yard. Bears, deer, raccoons, the odd mountain lion. It was a nice place to get away from our bustling lives in the lower mainland. It was a long weekend, at the beginning of August for BC Day, when we went up to the house for a weekend getaway. We got there on Thursday evening, and Friday I took my daughter and her friend out ATVing, before getting home just in time for dinner. My wife, Jenny, was glad that we were home because our German shepherds, Chester and Lily, were going crazy outside during the afternoon. We both thought it was probably a bear roaming around, as the dogs usually went nuts when wildlife came onto their property. The dogs were inside with my wife, and we didn't think anything more of it. But that evening, we sat down at the kitchen table to play some games. We were playing Monopoly when we heard our two dogs start to growl, and they made their way to the back door before starting to bark again. I got up to go see what the dogs were barking at, and I could see that the sensor light on the garage was set off. I reminded my dogs it was just bears, then I went back to play games. My dogs were very well trained and behaved, so they went back and laid down on their beds. I went back to the table to continue kicking ass on my family at Monopoly. I passed the dice over to my daughter, but she was caught in a gaze, looking out the dining room window. "You okay, sweetie?" I asked. My daughter pointed at the window. Daddy? What's that?" I looked out the window, and there was this face looking back at us. It was this massive, bulbous, pointed head. The eyes had yellow glint to them. My wife looked and started to scream, which sent the dogs back into a frenzy. I immediately called the dogs to the door and sent them outside to chase whatever it was away. I heard them barking as they ran towards the forest. Then I heard yelping from both of them as I opened the door to go outside and see if I could find them. As soon as I took one step onto the porch, both my shepherds came running back inside. Whatever it was out there literally scared the crap out of two 110-pound dogs. We were all kinds of weirded out by the encounter, and curiosity had got the best of me, and I walked outside with a flashlight. Now, the window we were looking at was about 8 feet off the ground outside. This thing, or whatever it was looking at us, was halfway up the window, which would have made it easily 9 to 10 feet tall. I went back inside, stunned at what I'd just learned. The next day, it was nice and sunny out, and I took the dogs outside to do their morning business. I had wandered back to underneath the window where this thing was standing. I looked down and saw the impressions of two giant, human-looking type feet. Now, I'm a size 12 shoe, and these prints made my feet look small. They had to be around 18 to 19 inches in length and at least 8 to 9 inches wide. I followed the tracks right into the forest. In between footsteps, it had to have been at least 6 feet. After looking at this, I'm pretty sure we had a Sasquatch running around. It didn't seem dangerous, more curious, but I hope it doesn't come back in our yard again. My name is Colin, and my experience with Sasquatch is more of my son's experience that I was involved in. This is a hard one for me to write because I literally lived every parent's worst nightmare when I couldn't find my boy in the forest. My story ends up with having a happy ending, but for those 10 or 12 hours, they were the scariest of my life, and I hope to never relive them again. For the record, for protection of those involved in this story, I am changing all of our names. Here's what happened. My best friend Barry and I have been best friends since elementary school. We grew up together, we work at the same mill together, we live in the same town up north near Vanderhoof. We each married women from our community, and we both raised our families here. We are both in our late 30s, and we've been pretty much inseparable as best friends since Barry moved to town when I was in grade 3. The only real difference is I have 2 kids and a dog. Barry and his wife have 3 kids and 2 dogs. Otherwise, our lives are pretty similar, except when it comes to hockey season, where for some ungodly reason, he cheers for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I've never been able to figure out that sickness. Both Barry and I have sons. Our boys Stanton and Dylan are both 11 years old and, coincidentally, in the same school class. Coincidentally, they're best friends as well. Up here, we do a lot of hunting in the fall, and for the last 3 years, Barry and I have been bringing our sons along for our weekend hunting trips. The boys have grown up in the wilderness with us, along with at the hockey rink as well. And I know I speak for Barry when I say this, that we couldn't be prouder of our sons and the young men they are becoming. The boys have both learned how to stay safe in the forest, never wander off on your own, and if you're not hunting, always make noise so that way any potential predators know not to come in your area. On this particular hunting trip, both Barry and myself were lucky enough to get some time off to take our boys on a week's vacation up north to go hunt for some moose and elk. We arrived at our campsite in the wilderness just outside of Dease Lake. Day 1 was scouting out some prime areas. Day 2, we 4 men started our hunt. But it was day 3 when all hell broke loose. Now, I'm sorry if I get a little emotional saying this, but I still can't believe this happened. It was about noon, and we were hiking up this ridge to get a good sight into a meadow where the bull moose are usually seen grazing. We were about 15 kilometers from our campsite. We had driven into the first 12 clicks before starting our 3-kilometer hike into the bush. As we sat along the rocks, looking into the valley below, my son Dylan mentioned that he had to go to the bathroom and was going to make his way up to the tree line to stay out of the line of sight for any potential moose below. He grabbed the roll of toilet paper and made his way up. After about 10 minutes, I started looking around, but Dylan wasn't back yet. I whispered over to Stanton to see if he could make his way up to see what's taking Dylan so long. Stanton made his way back to the tree line, which was about 70 feet behind us, but he immediately came back with the roll of toilet paper, saying, "Dylan's not there." I immediately jumped up and got sick to my stomach. I started yelling, "Dylan! Dylan! Where are you?" At this point, it wasn't about the moose. There's some big animals in this area. I immediately ran up to the tree line, with Barry following close behind. "Damn it, Dylan, where are you?" This wasn't like my son to play practical jokes like this, especially when we were out doing something as dangerous as hunting. I yelled at Barry, "You take Stanton that way," which was the way to the left of us and the way we came in, and I was going to go straight into the forest. My heart was pounding so hard I couldn't hear anything else. I started to well up and pray to God that my boy was all right, that he had just wandered off and maybe hurt himself. I started where he was supposed to be, and that's where I'd found he went to the bathroom. I started to expand my search, as there was a worn deer trail that was right beside where he went and done his business. There was literally no sign of him. It was like he had just vanished. I started walking faster. In the distance, I could hear Barry and Stanton calling out Dylan's name. but there was obviously no response back. We were too deep into the wilderness for our cell phones to get any signal. I started yelling my son's name again, but to no avail. The deer trail I was now jogging on started leading me towards the location of Barry and Stanton. I yelled over that I was on my way to meet them. We met at a fork on the trail where Stanton was crying because he had no clue where his best friend was. The three of us continued down this trail as the sun was peeking through the trees, so we had ample daylight to see into the forest. We had heard some heavy footsteps about 200 feet ahead of us, but we were armed and thought nothing of it. We were on a mission to find my son. We kept calling Dylan's name. As we went down the trail another 50 yards, we noticed something lying in the middle of it. It was Dylan's jacket. I held it up and looked it over, and there wasn't a scratch or a tear on it. The only thing out of the ordinary was this greasy type of oil that was on the front by the zipper. It almost looked like a large human handprint. We kept heading down the trail, looking for more clues as we were heading down the mountainside. Before we got too far, I told Barry and Stanton to head back up to our spotting area and grab the rest of our stuff. Dylan's gun was still up there, and I didn't want to leave our belongings in that area. I told them I was going to continue down the trail, and I would eventually meet up with them at the bottom by our truck. For the next hour, I was walking downhill. I kept hearing noises all around me, but I was sure it was my imagination. I kept going. I started to run on adrenaline, yelling for my son. Again, way ahead of me, I swore I heard heavy footsteps, like only big animals can make. I made it to the part of the trail where I had heard these sounds. I stopped and looked around, and I cocked and loaded my gun. I had this ominous feeling like I was being watched, but I kept going. I had made it almost to the bottom of the mountain when I heard the horn of Barry's truck honk. I ran down to the road with still no sign of Dylan, and I ran up the gravel road to meet up with Barry and Stanton, hoping that Dylan was with them. My heart broke again when I noticed Dylan was not. I mentioned to Barry that I was staying up here and that they needed to race to find cell phone service down the road about half an hour and call the police. When Barry left racing down the road, I was all alone in the middle of nowhere. I started to break down, dropping to my knees, screaming for my son at the top of my lungs. I knew I had to pull myself together and get back to searching for my boy. It was now around 5 p.m. He had been gone for 5 hours. The worst was starting to run through my head that a grizzly or a cougar had attacked him and carried him off. But I couldn't get past the silence. If there was a bear or cougar attack, we would have heard Dylan scream in fear or pain. We heard nothing. About 45 minutes later, Barry arrived back and let me know that the police and search and rescue were on their way. While we were waiting for help, we all started looking again, but to no avail. At about 6:30, the police and search and rescue arrived. We took them back up to the mountain to show them where Dylan was last seen. I was thankful there were a pair of search dogs with them to sniff out any scent of Dylan that could lead us to him. We got up the mountain as dusk was turning to dark. There were 20 of us up there, while a base camp was now being set up below at the bottom of the hill. We started searching the trail. The dogs immediately picked up on Dylan's scent from where he had gone to the bathroom. They started barking and going down the trail that I had taken earlier. They stopped at the area where we had found Dylan's jacket earlier. But one of the dogs started acting apprehensive about going forward. The master said this was something unusual for this particular dog, but after a few minutes we were able to get going down the hill. When we got about 200 yards from the bottom where the gravel road was located, the dog seemingly lost Dylan's scent. It was like he made it to this location, but vanished again. It was approaching around midnight, and I hadn't eaten or drank any water in hours. I was starting to get dizzy and shaky. Barry was over talking to the lead investigator looking for Dylan when he walked over to me and said we should head back to the campsite and grab something to eat. I was not in favor of this at first. There was no way I was going to leave my son in the middle of nowhere without me being here. But the more Barry talked to me about it, the more it made sense. And I really needed to refuel myself and get back out there to find my son. We drove back to the RV trailer at the campground, and it was all dark and silent. I felt numb, trying to figure out what I was going to tell my wife. How was she going to react back home when I'm 8 hours north looking for our boy? I started crying once again as I was chomping down on some cold hot dogs and potato chips. Barry brought me a shot of whiskey as I tried to compose myself. I knew I had to call her, but first I wanted to make sure I was man enough to handle the situation. I went to the back of the trailer, changed my clothes, then went to the bathroom so I could throw some cold water on my face. I then walked to the door, put my boots and jacket on. I started to sulk again, knowing my son was out there without a coat on, and the temperature now was starting to get close to freezing. I asked Barry to join me outside, as I was about to call my wife to fill her in on what's going on. As we stepped outside, in the distance, we heard some rustling. Barry went back in and grabbed his gun, just in case an animal was getting too close for comfort after smelling our food. We have had to fire off warning shots before to keep animals away from camp, so this was nothing out of the ordinary. We started to hear what sounded like running coming towards us. And that's when I heard, "Daddy?" Barry and I looked at each other. "Daddy? Dylan? Dylan? Is that you?" I started to run towards his voice. Barry was right behind me. Next thing I know, I am tackled by my boy. I just dropped to my knees, holding him, crying. "Where were you, boy?" as I asked through my tears. "You're alive. Oh, God. Thank you. You are fucking alive." My boy started crying as he held on to me with a death grip. "Where were you?" I asked. "I don't know, Dad," Dylan responded. Barry ran for his truck as he was going to speed over to the search and rescue teams and let them know Dylan had been found. I walked Dylan over to the RV, where I got him a change of clothes and something to eat. We sat in silence as I thanked God, or whoever was up there, for looking out for my son and bringing him back to me. I wasn't mad. I was confused. I still needed to know what happened and where he was. This is where Dylan gave me the fright of my life. He stated that after he had finished going to the bathroom, he stood up and pulled his pants back up. Then he bent down to grab his jacket and put it back on. That's when he smelled something stinky. At first, he thought it was himself from going to the bathroom. But then he saw something come right across his face, like a giant, black, leathery hand, and everything went dark. Dylan said he was then picked up by whatever it was, and it started running with him down the mountain. He never saw what it was, but he knew it was hairy, and it had padding, like where a woman's breasts would be located. He went on to say that it smelled really bad, like a skunk, and hair kept getting in his mouth. It just never seemed to stop running, until it became dark. Then it started to slow down. He said he could hear this thing huffing and grunting, sounds he had never heard before. Once it was completely dark, this creature had put him down. It was so dark in the forest, he could barely make out what it was in the moonlight that was mainly covered by trees. He knew it was big, way bigger than me, and I stand 6'2". Dylan said out of fear he did not run away from it, because he was afraid of the consequences of trying to escape. That's when this creature started whooping, and off in the distance, he heard one or two more of these things start whooping back. The whooping was so loud that he had actually covered his ears and started crying loudly, yelling at it to take him back to his family. That's when the creature scooped him up again and started running. He said they must have ran for a couple of kilometers before stopping again. That's when he heard rustling in the bushes, and this deep-toned chattery sound from another one of these things. He said it sounded like an argument between the two. That's when the other one came up and grabbed him forcefully and carried him off. Dylan didn't know where he was or which direction he was going. He said this other one had carried him for about an hour before just putting him down on this road and walking upright back into the bushes that they had just came from. That's when he saw the lights of our RV. He started running towards it, thinking about his safety. Only as he got closer, he recognized it was ours by sight. Shortly after Dylan finished his story with me, 3 police trucks and officers arrived and came out to talk with us. One officer, who was wearing a different uniform, asked if he could talk with Dylan privately, to which I obliged. I talked to the other 2 officers on scene, who were so proud to hear that Dylan found his way back to camp somehow. I gave them the Coles Notes version of what Dylan had described to me. That's when the 3rd officer came back over and asked to talk to me one-on-one. Officer Peter, which is the name we'll use, was an Indigenous police officer. He explained after what happened that I am a very lucky father to have my son back. I asked him, who took my son? What did my son see? He refused to answer and stated that the police would no longer be investigating this case. Although his final words to me were eerie enough. He stated that many people who've disappeared up in this area have never been found or seen again, and that I should be thankful that whatever it was that brought back my son was answering a prayer for a good outcome. Hi there, David Merle. I'd like to tell you a story about what happened to me and my one and only encounter with the legendary Sasquatch. You can call me Phil, as in my small town, there are a number of people who know who I am, so I'm going to try and deflect some attention because this isn't really something that I've talked a lot about publicly. I was born in Prince George, but moved south to 100 Mile House in the early 1970s. In our town, we'd often hear stories from the loggers about seeing some strange things in the forests. We'd hear about strange creatures being seen, or orbs of lights flying through the trees and then up into the sky. On this occasion, it was 1986, and I was dating a girl whom we'll call Tanya at the time. I was in grade 12, and Tanya was a year younger. We were heading out towards Ruth Lake to meet up with some family members for a birthday party. It was dusk on a Friday night as we were heading down Old Canham Hendricks Road, where we made a left at the store instead of turning right to head out towards Canham Lake. It was that time of night where there are still hints of blue sky above, but it's dark enough because of the trees you need to put your headlights on in order to drive. It was an early fall night, around 7:30 in the evening, when we passed the store and started heading out towards the cabin. I had an old Camaro for a car, and we were muscling it down this straightaway, a road that I had driven hundreds of times over the years. That's when we noticed something standing up in the ditch, about 100 yards ahead of us. My girlfriend and I both saw it as I started to slow down the car. Thinking it was a bear standing on its hind legs, looking at us, as there are hundreds of bears in this particular area. But as we slowed down, what happened next, to this day, scares the living hell out of me. I wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen to me. I'm doing about 40 kilometers an hour at this point, and we watched this hairy thing come out of the ditch towards us. I had my high beams on, thinking the light would scare this bear away, but it didn't. As we started to pass this creature, that's when I saw it come out of the ditch fully and onto the road. It was massive. It was huge. One of the biggest things I'd ever seen in my life. And then it pulled its arm back and literally slapped my windshield with its gigantic hand. It was like a giant human hand, but triple or quadruple the size. The noise was so loud, I thought I'd run this thing over. Immediately, Tanya screamed as she flung off her seatbelt and had went and curled herself into the floor underneath the giant Camaro dashboard. I immediately hit the brakes on my car, coming to a complete stop. I turned my head to look out the back window, which was lit up by my brake lights. I watched this bipedal creature walk about 20 feet behind my car. I saw the whole thing. It was about 7 to 8 feet tall, with hair all over its body. It didn't seem to pay attention to us or the car after hitting the window. I started breathing heavier as it paused, turned, looked right at me, then continued its stride across the road, gingerly climbing up an embankment and disappearing. I just sat there stunned. I didn't know what to do, or if what happened had actually happened. I looked down at Tanya to tell her everything was safe now. Shaken, she got back up into the seat and put her seatbelt on. We started to drive to the party, but we didn't know if it would come back. Crying in fear, Tanya asked if we could turn around and if I could drive her home. She was way too scared to continue on that evening, so unfortunately, we had to call it the night. The next day, I took a look at my windshield, which, surprisingly, wasn't cracked. I have no idea how my windshield held out. There was, however, a dent now in the frame where his hand must have hit. The paint was chipped in that area, so I could imagine how strong this creature was to cause that dent to happen. Years later, and now looking back, I wish I would have taken the time to investigate this more. Was there any hair caught in the damage? Was there any blood or skin particles? My 50-year-old mind works much better now than my 18-year-old mind did back then. I wish I would have taken the time to look into it more, take some photos, because all I have is this awesome encounter. But looking back, I'm sure there was more proof than I actually realized. Here at Canada's Great Unknown, we want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to our stories. You can really help us out by once again following us on Twitter at CGU Stories and on Instagram and TikTok at Canada's Great Unknown. Right here on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell so that way you can stay up to date with us when we post new content. We also encourage you to tell us your stories, which you can send to canadasgreatunknown@gmail.com. Until next time, thank you for listening to Canada's Great Unknown.